Okay, so in the last 89 years, with all that you've seen, in what ways do you think that the world is better off today, generally, and in what ways worse off? I know that's a very broad question, but some things might spring to mind. So societally, politically,
Well,
economically,
Ecologically.
ecologically.
well, don't get me started. Today, there's an enormous amount of whinging and grizzling about this is not right and that's not right, and you know you've got all sorts of ideologue nutcases loose, and with social media, it's far worse. But in real terms, if you examine things properly, and I have had lists that I've got that I don't have in front of me, unfortunately, which would be good to have, of the way things are better than they used to be. It's just colossal. Education is not as free monetarily as it used to be. That's not a good thing. But by and large, for instance, when I was born, as I said, my aunt was a trained nurse and eventually went to the Australian Inland Mission in Alice Springs, where mostly they catered for not just the local population, but the local Aborigines, who were in a shocking state. Historically, even well before the white people came to the country, their situation was constantly dire. But the founder of the hospital that she worked for, the Australian Inland Mission, was on a mission to do as much good for them as possible. And that's downplayed a lot these days because there's a kind of ideological push by certain sections of the community, especially certain sections of the media, where they can make money out of saying how badly off the Aborigines are. However, that's a whole different story. By and large, everybody is far better off. The access to knowledge is tremendous with this disgusting mob American outfits called Yahoo and Google and others, but they do provide a tremendous service. You can find out the in-depth factual knowledge if you're careful with what you do. Education is broader. There is far less bigotry. In the old days, religion had a very high regard everywhere. 80 to 90% of people would always declare what their religion was, even though 80 or 90% of them didn't ever go to church. And religion basically was a very good influence in that it did at least teach morals and explain empathy and love and consideration and justice and so forth. But we're far better off without the hard edge of that these days. And socially and economically we're better off in hundreds of different ways. I'd have to get my list out to start to go through it all to tell you all about it. Worse off, well, World War II. World War I was a very bad thing. World War II was a very much worse thing. I can tell you an instance about World War II, which is probably not appropriate just at this moment, about something in relation to World War II while I was at Churchie. But it was the influence of the lower edge of American culture apart from, of course, from the far, far lower edges of Japan and Germany and Italy. But then came the 60s, when people liked the freedom, so-called, that came with some of the social changes after World War II. And there was a colossal drop in moral outlooks. And we suffer from the consequences of that in a big way today. In a state where abortion is supposed to be illegal, it's possible to know from the medical records that there are about 12,000 abortions in Queensland last year, in spite of all the prophylactics that are available. And this is not really good for social outcomes. So that's the best and the worst. There's been some bad events politically.
What do you think? More self-actualisation for women has done to society? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, nobody would want to go back to pre-World War II days.
Not just our society, but societies in general.
There are what you might call developing countries, in other words, backward countries, where some of the aspects of pre-World War II social attitudes still prevail. And women are very, very poorly treated. That's a very, very bad thing. Things were never that bad in this country. My mother never complained about her position. My mother's sisters, my father's sisters, and his mother never complained about their sister's position. Nana was a very outspoken woman. Nobody put anything over her. She always insisted on having her own way. She had 6 children, but was she was able to run a business. My grandfather's sister ran the best hotel out on the Darling Downs for years, very well managed. She had a couple of children, brought them up while she was running the hotel, very successfully. So I think sometimes the women's liberation movement is an overplayed theme these days. And there is a lot of distortion involved with the media, who wants to make something of it all the time. Women, of course, are born with advantages that men don't have. And it used to be said that women rule the world, even pre-World War II. And there's some truth. Well, I can tell you, if you talk about my grandmother, she certainly ruled the world around herself. My mother, not so much. I lost the trail there.
That's all right. I asked you about the equality of women and what effect it's had on things, and you sort of answered that.
Yeah.
Good in general.
Yeah.
A lot of the time that gets coupled with the sexual revolution, those things seem very...
Face the
separable.
mic when you talk.
What about some of the big ideas that came out of World War II? So the influences of this very post-Enlightenment pseudo-scientific way that Nazis analysed race and ordered superiority, and then also the clashing concept of communism and revolutions that had toppled a lot of monarchies the early part of last century. Did you see any of those filtering through into Australia at that point, or was Australia pretty safe from those ideologies at that point?
Well, Australia survived the communist influence largely. I do remember very well in the 40s, the Labor Party had as part of its platform clauses directly out of the communist platform, directly. Their aim was the nationalisation of finance, media, and I forget what the other three main influences anyhow.
Yeah.
And the Labor Party policy was to aim for nationalisation of those three things: banking, media, I forget what the other one was, just off the top of my head. Due to be 90, I think. So we were saved from that, but there were certainly strong communist influences. But we were in Australia quite quick to realise that communism was just a total failure, and it has been a total failure right throughout the world. And anywhere under the influence of communism today is a pretty sad state. So certainly that was a big thing 80, 70 years ago. But in Australia we seem to have survived it quite well. The other thing you mentioned? Sexual revolution.
No, Nazism. So,
Nazism.
So we were at war. Britain was at war. Was there a general nationalistic moment of unity where everyone was unified against what the Germans were doing, or was there dispute over that, and some people thinking that it's not our issue to be involved in, and there's some good points about the Nazi Party and what Germany was doing.
It'd be pretty hard put to find any good points about the Nazi Party, really. However, the Germans, of course, had taken a resounding defeat in World War One, and as a sense of justice, they were made to pay reparations to the rest of the world for the damage they'd done. And would you believe, it's only 5 or 6 years ago that they finally paid the last of the reparations that they had to pay due to the damage they caused the world in World War One. But there was a lot of resentment in Germany, and Hitler was able to rise up and take advantage of that resentment, and he gained political power quite beyond what you'd normally expect due to that resentment and animosity that arose after the way they were treated after World War One, although it was all their fault anyhow. Germany was soundly defeated in World War II, but as you say, was there a little bit of lack of resolve amongst some of the Allies, and this really gets straight up my nose. I have no respect really for the American United States culture in many ways. I mean, you got to go back to Noah Webster and his illiterate dictionary that was deliberately made to be illiterate to toady to the bushies who created their own shortcuts in the language. But during World War II, Great Britain and all her dominions supported Great Britain, but because Hitler had been so successful in enrolling the assistance of Mussolini in Italy, and a lot of Roman Catholic countries around about Europe decided, from the Pope, we believe, that if Hitler was to take over a lot of these countries that he was at war with, it wouldn't be a bad thing for Roman Catholicism.
Rebuilding the Roman Empire.
Well, rebuilding the Roman Church, anyhow. And the Pope played a very poor role in this at the time. So Spain remained neutral, but they gave harbour to all the German warships around the Atlantic. Argentina remained neutral and gave harbour to all the German warships in the southern Atlantic. Okay? So this was played very much into the theme that you just mentioned briefly. Very bad outlook there. And when you think about the situation that Britain was in 1942, invasion was absolutely imminent. The skies were alive with German bombers, which were absolutely flattening London and all the major British cities. And these facts, of course, were concealed from even Britain's allies because they didn't want it to be known how bad things were. So Britain was really under imminent threat of invasion. And they took the biggest gamble you could imagine that they could possibly take. Churchill and his leading few in the military and the government commissioned their major asset, which I think was the Ark Royal aircraft carrier, to travel the Atlantic, which was riddled with German submarines, to go to America, where they pulled up offshore, anchored, and asked for a discussion at a high level with the President. And after this discussion that went on for a day or two, America finally agreed to assist. And their condition was that Britain must give up all its dominions throughout the world, all its colonies. In other words, give up the world domination that Britain had enjoyed for a century or two in favour of America, and then America would help you. What a mongrel act. However, Germany, Hitler, in his lunacy, declared war himself on America. So that solved that problem anyhow. Then America did nothing about Japan on the other side, because they could see that, you know, we can deal with Japan in our own way afterwards. Let them take over all these backward countries, and we'll deal with it as we need to, because they had this enormous fleet in Pearl Harbor. Then Tojo, Japan, in another act of self-arrogance beyond belief, went into and decimated, more than decimated means it takes 10% of everything. The Japs came in and took 90% of Pearl Harbor, just flattened them. So America then was forced to come and fight Japan, otherwise they'd have sat in their bums and done bloody nothing to help the rest of the world at all. So I've got no time for American culture generally, because none of it's improved. I'm sorry to say.
None of what culture has improved?
America, US, USA.
Oh, yes.
And here we are, we go down the street now and we buy, as I had to do yesterday, a packet of cookies. I mean, cookies? Who ever heard of cookies? It's biscuits. Butter. Okay. Enough of that.
With Japan, I suppose Australia was really a British outpost at the foot of Asia that looked back towards Britain and European culture predominantly.
Yes.
But Japan had risen up and become an imperial power itself and had beaten the Russians by this point in time.
Yes.
Was Japan really
And
on
was all over China.
Yes, and was already all over. Was that on Australia's radar at the time? Or
Very much.
It was.
We were very worried.
Yeah. What was the perception of Japan and Japanese culture at that point?
Well, remember, 1939, I was only 8,
Yes.
so I can't go into depth about that. But as the war wore on, 38, 39, I was very conscious of it. And Darwin was absolutely flattened in the bombing range. Townsville was bombed. Other places were bombed. We had Japanese submarines in Sydney Harbour, and New Guinea had been invaded. Now, my wife's brother-in-law went to New Guinea in the army and fought at Milne Bay, which is in the far east of New Guinea on the bottom coast. And they had expected the Japs to come over in tanks loaded off ships on the north, because they had invaded the north and were all over it. So Australia sent in, I think it was a 5-inch cannon and a company of Australian soldiers in Milne Bay. And the Japs arrived through the jungle, not with tanks. They came pretty much on foot and just dominated the local natives and told them to do everything and feed them and everything else. And they began to turn up in the jungle off the beach at Milne Bay. And the Australians didn't know what the hell, how they're going to handle this.
I was remembering.
But they had these cannon, 5-inch shells, which were anti-tank. And they worked out that the anti-tank missile that it projected was designed to go through the armour of the tank and explode after a 5-second delay inside the tank. So the Australians had a bit of target practice on a couple of palm trees, coconut palms, and found that they could hit a palm tree with this. So they waited for the Japs to arrive in numbers, and they opened fire with half a dozen of these cannon, put their projectile through the palm trees, straight through, and the bloody thing exploded about 5 seconds later, right in amongst the Japs, and they didn't know what hit them. And they went for their lives. And that was the first time the Japs had been defeated at all in World War II. Milne Bay. And it certainly woke us up to the Japanese situation. And it was after that about that time that they'd already bombed Pearl Harbor and brought the Americans in.
I suppose at that time as well, what made Australia's situation more dire was the fact that being subservient to Britain, all of our best troops had gone over to places in Europe and North Africa, and what was left to defend Australia were not as our strongest force.
We eventually had to draw the line and say we're sending no more over to North Africa and the Middle East. We're going to have to defend ourselves. We did stand up to them eventually, and that took place. But you can imagine Churchill's approach. That's the centre of civilization over there, and they want it saved. But at the same time, we had to deal with ourselves, and thank God the Japs had been stupid enough to bring America into it, thinking that they were demolishing it completely, and of course they didn't. because the Americans were producing these massive bombers by the day. Factories all over America were producing these massive bombers and the aircraft, because they realised this is the only way they're going to go out and get across the Pacific to their bases that they did have left and make a fight of it. So it was miraculous that we were saved by them. And of course the Americans did the right thing. They sent MacArthur to Japan, and he said, righto, sorry guys, we're going to give you our culture. And they did instill, without taking it over and making the colony and the captive,
which Japan was expecting.
which they were expecting, and that should have happened in some respects. But MacArthur took a very civilised view of it all, decided to hold their goodwill as much as possible after it all happened, and educate them. And it turned out today, you know,
Now we're allies.
before now that we're good allies, and before the rise of China, they were our biggest export market, because Japan has almost no natural resources like iron and coal and oil or anything like that at all.
Just bored of all the planes going over.
You'll be done with this.
It's plane time.
To Australians, what was the most shocking thing about Japan and Nazi Germany? Was it ideology or the use of total war tactics? Or
Yeah, well, obviously the use of total war tactics only a decade or so after World War One finished. Because it
was it World War One where you had the Geneva Convention and agreeing on the rules of
was
war?
the war to end war.
Yeah.
1918, armistice, 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. Another thing the Americans would get backwards, they put the month before the day and all this sort of rubbish.
Do you think there's going to be another world war?
Couldn't possibly. It's just going to be
Too silly?
No. You can be silly. You've only got to look at Trump. He mightn't have gone for a world war. He'd probably make friends with the enemy as far as possible, which might be a good thing in some respects. But if China wants to take out, this is the big worry. The big worry today is China is behaving precisely the way Hitler behaved through 1930s.
I agree.
Precisely.
Smarter, slower.
And
more
smarter and
patient.
slower and more subtly.
Mm.
Big risk. Big risk. There'll be wars because there'll be places that won't put up with him, and he'll just move in with the army.
I suppose now it seems like militaristic deterrence is preventing war. Like the only reason that China hasn't taken Taiwan is
Absolutely. The atom bomb is one of the best things that ever happened. Absolutely the best thing, because it happened to the best people. Just historical luck or the grace of God or something, I don't know what.
totally agree.
So there won't be a World War, I don't believe.
You don't think there'll be another world war?
No, it won't be a world war, but
Oh, you think
China
China-
will attempt to take over the world for sure, and there'll be serious wars, but it won't be world war, because in any world war we'll put in the king hit, won't we? The atom bomb, and nobody wants that. Just too prohibitive.
So you're saying that nuclear war is the main deterrent
Absolutely,
to future wars?
absolutely.
So besides obviously Americans coming out as the big victors and our big allies in the Pacific, and our culture, I suppose, turning towards them more than Britain, what were some of the other triggers that created that knock-on effect, like the baby boomer generation and the 60s, and how did that all come about in that 15 years after Second World War? It seems
Well,
so
the baby boomer generation was just a natural everybody, all these soldiers, tens of thousands of them coming back from the war, their sweethearts waiting for them. What do you think's going to happen? It'll be a baby boom, don't you think?
Yeah.
That was the baby boom, and it went on for some years. Culturally, of course, the war. When I was at Churchie, we used to go rowing on a Saturday morning, and the rowing was in the Brisbane River, Mowbray Park. Boat shed still there. So we all went down there one Saturday morning, early in the morning. We're going to get out in the river and we're going to row all the way up to Milton or somewhere and back. The tides were right. We were going to be having a great morning out rowing. And this was 1945. The war was not finished, but it was going our way. And the Americans were thick right across Queensland. There was even a camp of soldiers out near Warra, because they were ready to go to Darwin in case of anything adverse happening. And there were American soldiers all over the place. And American and Australian soldiers did not get on well at all, because American soldiers were paid about 5 times as much as the Australian soldiers were. And they splashed the money around the girls, and the girls thought they were just lovely. So we go down to row at Mowbray Park one morning at 6 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning, and there's a band rotunda there, right? With 2 steps to get into it. No band on at 6 o'clock on Saturday morning. But there were 2 American officers and 2 American, Australian females in their 20s, quite well dressed. So there was officers and some quite well dressed ones, not the riffraff around town. Absolutely stone cold, motherless, drunk. The girls were sitting on the top steps, lying back, flat out with their legs apart. And as we sat there getting the boat out, one of them peed herself, completely oblivious, while the 2 officers were just working them over. I mean, had everything open, just having a wonderful time, and they were just had a great Friday night out, full as boots, and this is marvellous. So that was my impression of.
It's a good snippet of history.
A snap of history.
So nothing really changed
It
in
was
the 60s. You told me nobody behaved like that.
Nobody behaved like that, only the Americans during the war. And when the Americans went, it all reverted somewhat to normal, except that there were more loose parties, for sure. And within 10 years, of course, it was pretty widespread. The 60s,
But do you think that war, though, makes people more conservative or more debaucherous, or a weird combination of both?
No, I don't think it's.
When you look at documentaries,
Not too sure how you'd categorise that.
how the World War affected the general people in Europe, it was way more directly affected than we would have been.
Yes,
Sure.
yes.
Like poverty on the
Oh,
streets.
and death and destruction all around and everything.
Yeah,
else. That's right.
But the 60s in the UK seem very vibrant and culturally interesting. You sort of had
Culturally interesting.
well,
Yes.
in a creative way. But I suppose, was it the baby boomer generation that created youth culture that then created a breakdown of tradition and morals? And how did that come about? 'Cause it doesn't seem like anything existed before youth culture.
I think those that came back from the war and they had even the females in Australia who had experiences, they were the ones that had the children. And they might have been a little bit looser with their moral imperatives on their children, right? because the moral imperatives on Elsa and I, from our parents, were pretty absolute. And well justified and explained and everything else, not any kind of bloody dictatorial downtrodden.
It all had a utility.
Well, absolutely. And there were all sorts of consequences, all sorts of poor behaviour, and we all understood those consequences. But in the 60s, suddenly nobody bothered too much about the bloody consequences in the cities. And this was another thing. Because after all, Elsa and I were born in a country town. I was born in a country town with about 20 houses. Dalby had 7,000 population only. So it was a real country town. Everybody knew everybody else, and if anybody got into trouble, if a young girl went away for 3 months out of town and came back, either she'd had a baby and brought one back, or she'd had an abortion. Because it's pretty rare for that to happen. And people say, "Oh, what's going on there?" She was playing up with this guy, you know, what happened there?
So I think small towns were more moral because
Absolutely,
of the
absolutely, because everybody was close on these things, and there was a moral atmosphere. But after the war, we became cityfied and far greater. I mean, if you look at the statistics on population of the country now compared to the city, I think something like 80% of the people who used to be in the country are no longer there. I mean, my farmer and his 3 daughters are a family that control 5 farms, where 5 families used to live. So everybody's become cityfied, and you can get away with God knows what in the city. Nobody knows who you are, it doesn't matter, wacko, good fun. So cityfication is definitely demoralised, low morally.
I noticed that between the ages of 5 and 15, the internet had gentrified the regions as well, because the trends were all the same as the cities.
Yeah, that's all true.
What effect has contraception had on society, do you think, since the World War? World War II?
Well, my grandfather had a brother, Andy Best, who lived across the highway from our farm. He had 2 daughters, 2 sons. None of them got married. Because why would you buy a book when you can join the library? The 2 sons were boozers. Boys around town. Okay? Now, I'm sorry, the 2 girls didn't marry and the eldest son didn't marry, but the second son did eventually marry a girl, and they had children. He turned out never changed, he was always a drunk. He spent his pay on a Friday afternoon down the pub and come home and there's nothing for the week's groceries. So there was marital dissent, and he was abusive to her. Bad outcome. But the 2 boys were known around town to get packages in the post.
Of condoms?
Which everybody knew was condoms. Right? No chemist in town.
Because at the post office surveying.
Yes, that's right. That's right. That's right. I said, oh, here we go. There's a dance in town next week. Hello. Watch out, ladies. And you would find this did go on. a friend of ours came out from the
what decade is this?
This is the 1940s, late 40s, after the war, early 50s. A friend of ours at a dance in Dalby one night, the hall, St Joey's Hall, had a spare lopper beside it, grassy. And there was a girl in town who had a list. And as our friends came out of this dance, when it was over, they were walking past this grassy allotment, and then the girl says, don't stop, dear's knife. So the condoms were getting the work out, right? But this was, rare. It was only certain.
It wasn't mainstream.
There were a couple of girls around town that were known to be a bit easy, not well brought up, and anything goes. And there's a couple of boys around town, of course, that was quite happy to take advantage of that. And that was, everybody knew these people, and you didn't mix or necessarily too close with it. They had 2 or 3 of their own friends, and that was that. None of them were our friends. Okay? But it all changed within 10 years. So, yeah, the World War II opened us up to the rest of the world, you'd have to say. And never mind blaming the Americans, Europe was worse. Europe was worse, especially the Balkans and those places, my God, Mm-hmm.
So, what's going on? The dog on the step?
So that allowed the sexual revolution of the 60s and facilitated that, and you think that was the nail in the coffin for the snowballing effect of
Well, it's a snowballing effect
I
because
think
the parents.
sexual revolution proper began with the pill.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Because women could then control
Absolutely.
their own.
Or they thought they could. Let's face
Pregnancy.
them, they're not reliable, these things.
Yes, but that was the general thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
It's true.
that also led to
Yep.
breakdown of marriage because there were a lot of young women
Not happy where they were.
who understood that to be equal meant, well, you can do that, I can do that too.
What do you think?
So women, definitely. Women who'd been, I don't want, it's not about me, but women who'd been pretty much under the thumb because their own biological circumstances dictate that they must be circumspect in everything they do. Well, they'll be the one who ended up carrying the baby. Suddenly have freedom to control that.
Yeah. But men were brought up to respect that. They really were. Except for these louts who are sons of my uncle.
And how common was that? Like would someone just
No.
get a person knocked up and then move to a different town or something like that?
Yeah. That happened.
That's as old as man, that act, I think. So it's all very well to say men respected it.
Well, men and
Many
women, men and women are not equal. It's just a total bloody.
I don't think anyone
Fallacy.
said they're the same, and that's what you're conflating.
Equally merited. And
What they're saying is equally merited,
different
equally
behaviours.
deserving of the same rights.
Well, men can't have children. Can't bear children. Women have the privilege of being able to do that and nurturing the children, and they're built to do it and emotionally capable of doing it. Men, to their detriment, quite often. Sometimes are not. Quite often are not. So there is a
Smoking,
fate. Fate determines some of this. It's not just some kind of conspiracy to put women down. Or anything. So, as far as equality at work, my great grandfather had 8 children. My grandfather had 6, and their wives were not in any form downtrodden, but they couldn't go out and do paid 9 to 5 job when they've got all that on their hands.
And the bill changed that fundamentally. You don't have, no women has, well, 2% of women would have 8 children out of choice.
That's right. Nobody these days much yet.
Most women would have 1 or 2 if they had a choice, which is what's happening since contraception.
Well, I had Auntie Mabel, Cliff's wife, had 1 child, and she didn't have a good time. And she said, "My God, no more of that, but never, ever, ever." My father's sister, Mari, was not keen to get married, but Charlie was a nice guy, and came from a family who was reasonably well off. They were the Bakers, and they drove a Buick around town. And she agreed to marry him only on condition that they don't have children. So there is that choice. But if women choose to have children and want to go to work, well, that's a decision for them.
I suppose, so the dynamic's different now, and I'm curious how it was before. Because now it seems like the idea of marriage is around love and the sex life and stuff like that, but before contraception, obviously if it was that way, how would you manage the amount of children that you had? How would you have any possible choice over that? Because to a point, if you wanted to stop at 4 kids or 2 kids or whatever, would you just have to stop having sex?
No. There's the good plain withdrawal method.
Which always works.
It worked up until Faye was born. That was 7 or 8 years. And then they were, at that age, they thought they were probably not going to have any in any case, but bang, it happened. And I know it was widely used entirely. Withdrawal method.
Yep.
Bing, pull out at the crucial moment.
That's interesting. I thought that was an American evangelical invention.
That's a total myth, but anyway.
Total myth. Well,
Well, there's
you can
sperm.
always finish the lady off after you
There's
pulled out.
sperm in the pre-cum. Anyway, it's not that.
That's fascinating. Anyway, but it's has the dynamic of marriage and the expectations of marriage changed, and what do you think has led to the higher divorce rate?
Well, the high divorce rate, no question, is that women today have choices that they didn't have before. And there's a hell of a lot of marriages that should have ended, probably, and didn't in the older days, because of those circumstances. Exactly. These days, if a woman is not happy with the husband in any respect, she can say, "I think we can close the doors and go a different way." And there isn't the social attitude against it that there used to be either.
So that's a good point. And I would like to know what you think. A bad point of the 60s did seem to be a lot of men just going for younger women because they could, divorcing their wives.
In the 60s,
70s more.
70s more? 70s, 80s?
well, women were free. There's no question about it. Especially when the pill came along. So there were men that took advantage of it. But the whole point about marital fidelity is all depends on the child yet to be born. You bring a child into a world where the parents are not truly, deeply associated, really dedicated in love, this is a bad outcome. And there's more of it. There's no doubt about it. And a lot of this infidelity today is coming from the children of the baby boomers, because it accumulates. You go back to the history of Rome, women were totally free and easy at the fall of Rome in 400 AD, right? And it's often put down, the fall of Rome was due to absolute abandonment of social morals. There's a lot of other things as well, of course, but it is put down to that in many respects. And it's fair comment to say that a great deal of that's occurring right now, because when you listen to the people who are in serious trouble, like so and so was found dead, and somebody else is on drugs, and you look at the parents involved, and the parents say, "Oh, why did the coppers do this to my boy?" And you look at them, look at the bloody parents. I mean, what?
I agree.
Okay, so it's very cumulative, which wasn't the case in the days of high morality and religious acceptance in those days. I'm not saying it was all free and pure.
But it's something that's been lost.
Absolutely been lost, absolutely. No question.
So is that a breakdown of society on a granular level that just creates worse people, and there's just worse decisions being made within a society that has an accumulative effect?
Yes. I think probably a mitigating effect that might hopefully slow it down a little bit, is that the birth rate has dropped away. The Australian birth rate is nowhere near enough just to maintain our own population. And in most educated areas of the world, that's the case. The sad part is that the global crisis today with climate is due primarily to wild overpopulation. Men can't bother to keep in control of themselves. They've got control of the women in India to a large extent, and China to some extent. Certainly in Central Africa, it's absolutely shocking. And the population would have been far, far greater if it hadn't been wars between tribes that killed millions in recent decades, and disease outbreaks, like even now and with this pandemic, that's keeping the population in those places down. And since they're all wanting
Can I ask a question?
motorbikes, motor vehicles, air conditioning, industrialisation, here goes the clumping, all due to population pressures.
Can I ask a question? Yes. Oracle.
Who's Oracle?
Do you think Trump was the wrecking ball that America needed right now?
America needed. Well, if you catch a venereal disease, do you think, that was a good lesson?
It's a good analogy. It's a good analogy.
Well, that's it.
Yeah.
End of story.
Yeah. He's opened the floodgates for a lot of bad trajectories.
And it's hopefully woken a lot of people up. My God, what did we do? But talking about American culture, the fact is that the best they can come up with is this partly reformed communist, heavy socialist, who's, as luck would have it, is going to be heavily restrained by an opposition Republican Senate. But between him and Trump, I mean, if you'd pick one or the other and gave them full power, where the hell would you be? God.
What do you think the right amount of socialism is? Because obviously it's well, I mean, with cheaper subsidized education, public services, healthcare,
The context of that is America would describe us as a socialist
Yes.
because they don't like any level of government.
Yeah, some do. The Republicans don't.
That's what the Republicans think.
That's true. It's true. So
So
it's
what's the right level of
well,
government?
that's a great example of extreme ideologues, and you've got them both over there. Extreme ideologues in both bloody directions. Moderation is the way to go. I mean, you're talking to an Anglican after all. The modus, the
What is the
via
right level?
the via media in Greek,
What's the right level of
the
government?
the middle road.
What's the right level of government and what should be government controlled?
Like, where have we gone too far, and where should the government go further? In Australia, as an example.
Well, I think we need to facilitate education a bit better than we do, but it's a bit hard to do and then charge. Well, you know, we need foreign students to help finance the universities. Otherwise, they'd be charging local students even more. So there has to be a way of somehow helping that along.
Well, then you have the conundrum as China's our biggest market, but we also have these things called the Confucius Institutes on every campus.
Shocking.
Yeah.
Absolutely got to stop. So if we finance the universities, they wouldn't have to do it.
So you think the government should spend a bit more on universities?
Yes. Well, with strings attached.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the way to do it, I think. We used to do it, and that's the way to do it. I don't have much time for the left wing of Australian politics, but they did a few good things in that respect, going back 20 years or so.
Do you think the universities now have been dominated too much by left-wing politics?
Oh God, yeah. Well, the
Just as a caveat on that, or they've always been dominated. I mean, universities are think tanks
When did that happen?
generally.
So the 70s thing, you
It's
had a lot of
always been
academics
the
that were very
case, Philip.
sympathetic
If you
with
go to
communism.
university to study, particularly in the arts, you know, you read widely, so you're suddenly aware of all of these, and a tendency towards leftism in those early university years is pretty much a standard thing, I would have thought. And I've only been aware of what goes on at university for 40 years, but that's my experience of it. Most students that go to uni are left wing while they're at uni, and everyone I knew was left wing while they're at uni. As they've grown up, they've gone back usually into their family camps.
But it seems to come from the professors a lot, particularly in the humanities and arts.
Dad's not aware of the current crisis,
But it seems it's been like that since the 70s.
not like it is now. What you're talking about that's happening now has mainly been seeded on American campuses, and it's only spread, ideas of that have only spread here by social media, that extreme end of, you know.
There's a lot of talk about the extreme right on social media, of course.
Yeah, there's that too, but in university environments they tend to be small pockets of righteous indignation rather than
That's
the
right.
norm.
Yeah.
After this interview, I'll fill you in on some of these new ideas. You'll have a laugh.
Well, I've had a notion for a long time about the arts law stream in universities, and I think it was part of almost a conspiracy amongst some of the academics 30 odd, 40 years ago, you know, just stack them. And they push all this, and they're pushing it in the schools even now, in education, in state schools. The kids are encouraged to be activists about things like, you know, climate and stuff like this.
What's wrong with that?
Well, it has to be
They
fact-based.
shouldn't be. There's far too much extreme ideologies in social media, and kids under the age of 18 shouldn't be pushed into it.
What do you think about Greta Thunberg?
Oh God, bugger me dead, don't let me start. I'd give her a mouthful. Shut her up forever.
It's a woman.
I would
isn't
shut her up forever.
She's a child.
it?
She's a university student, exactly right in the area I'm talking about.
She's not actually.
She's 17.
She's a school student.
17.
And she's got
So I said.
Asperger's.
Hmm?
She's self-taught.
Self-taught, is she? Oh, I bet she's been highly influenced by her parents.
No, actually she influenced them.
Is she? No, right, I'm wrong.
Why do you think people get so upset about her? Why?
Do people?
Because she's
I
a
thought
17-year-old.
Why get upset about a 17-year-old?
she's just
Because-
wrong in everything she says.
Because you shouldn't have personality cults around activists. It should 100% go back to the scientists. If someone's an activist and they want to be a social mouthpiece, they just need to.
That's right.
But
Say-
all she ever
to
does
back to
is say,
resources.
read the science, don't listen to me. That's all she ever says.
She cops a lot more because she's a 17-year-old.
And she's not following the science herself. She's only following certain ideological corners of the science, such as, oh, you know, we shouldn't do this, we shouldn't do that. You know very well that my attitude is it's population, which never gets mentioned by any of these alleged scientists.
I do notice that. And another thing that I notice is it always got like people don't want to mention the third world, who are having the population crisis.
Exactly.
Because they're still developing and are not yet contributing as much as the first world.
Still developing, you mean they're still backward.
But then all of the progressives, obviously we want them to reach first world living conditions. And then what happens?
Here's another thing. People talk about the left politics as being the bloody progressives. I mean, where did this come from suddenly?
Okay, could you give us a feel on that? I'd love to hear your take on that. How did that come about? And what do you make of it?
Well, I think it comes from America.
Mm.
Progressives. I'd like to start a progressive liberal party because they call themselves liberal progressives over there. I'd like to start a progressive liberal.
Well, no, progressivism has actually become anti-liberal to an extent, and you will find progressives that are anti-liberalism.
Oh, really?
Yep.
Okay, I got that wrong.
Well, what, actually, here's it.
Somebody said I was
Surely
wrong
you
once.
don't think that the...
No, that was a mistake.
Free
Surely-
speech is liberalism, and they don't like free speech or
Yeah,
liberalism.
okay.
Surely you don't think that the LNP that we have today is anything on true conservatism, which is what the Liberal Party was born to be.
They seem very
with
American.
this weird
Yes. So there's
Bible bashing element. They've
Bible
got
bashing element.
Oh, Corey Bernardi. You know, they've got a fundamentalist element, and
What's his name?
Scott himself.
Who
is a
was
big
the bloody
apostle.
premier a while ago? Campbell Newman. You think he's a Bible basher?
Oh, is that here?
Don't think so.
No,
I'm not talking about Queensland politics. I'm talking about the federal LNP and the
Oh, ScoMo going to church on the front.
element among them, which would be Peter Dutton,
Oh yeah.
Corey Bernardi,
Yeah.
who are feral,
Yeah.
fundamentalist right wing, climate change deniers, and all the rest of it.
which is very different to the Tory party at the moment.
Very different
So-
to what the
Yeah.
LNP
Okay, well,
started to be.
Yeah, okay, well that's a bad move. We've got to root them out.
So Margaret Thatcher's environmental minister, for example, went on a massive rant against Tony Abbott, calling him a climate change denialist and saying conservatives are there to conserve. And he seemed very American compared to what British conservatives were like, despite him paying lip service to British culture.
Yeah. Yes, Well, different personalities.
Honestly.
Yeah.
What do you think of Peter Dutton?
Oh, he's doing a job as far as I know.
I want to give some insight on this is my question, Philip. You can have another one. Some insight on why you dislike Sarah Ferguson, Leigh and Emma Alberici and the
Because arts, law, I didn't mention journalism because it's in the same stream and they come straight from it, and they're into their own careers and they're into sensationalism like all journalists. They complained, for instance, about the raid on the ABC files following the exposures of the atrocities perpetrated by the American soldiers in the Middle East, which had to be brought to light. I certainly agree. But the way they brought it to light was, oh, look what we found. We're the greatest, and we're going to take over. Look at all the damage we're going to cause to all the people we don't like the right wing. Okay? Their responsible thing to do was to go to the head of the army and the minister that controls the army and say, we have strong evidence that this has taken place. You need to do something about this because we are going to publicise it. Right?
Yeah.
Rather than coming out and publicising it and then complaining about the fact that they're going to be investigated as they're having broken the law and risked our security to some extent, at least the security of some of the operatives, which they certainly did. Very, very irresponsible.
But really, what would we do without shows like Four Corners? And there's very few left in the world.
I don't say we should do without Four Corners at all. I think we should have it, but we've got to act responsibly. And Leigh Sales and Four Corners don't, in many respects. And when they get people on, their main aim is to just attack and undermine.
So you find them too high-minded and dogmatic, not looking at the long-term impacts.
Well, it depends what you call high, as far as mindedness goes. But yeah,
Self-perceived.
but idealogues and serving the ideology, right? And the self-perception of, you know, we are the fourth estate. Whatever it, after the crown, the government and the law. What's journalism? The fourth estate, the fifth. What do they call themselves?
I'm not sure.
You're not sure? Come on. This is
Integral part
I
of
think they call it the fourth estate, don't they? In
Sounds
other
right.
words, they're up there with the crown and the judges.
Yeah.
We are the media, journalism. Okay. Well, that comes with responsibility.
Yes, I agree.
Okay. That's my attitude.
Yes, but you wouldn't want to shut the ABC.
I didn't say that at all. No.
Well, can I ask, what do you think of the state of Rupert Murdoch's news talk, but a bit more broadly his global mediascape and Fox News and the importation of American values into Australia via that Republican values?
Rotten. Yeah, he's a law unto himself due to the physical fact that he's, you know, controls the bloody media in so many places. And yeah, he's got his leanings and they're not good.
So something that I can't reconcile is what an antidote to that is, because obviously you don't want to have too many regulations over the media, but do you think it was right to have laws around percentages of media ownership to prevent monopolies like that over media?
Okay. Just on a general subject, the attitude that I have I believe that we did the wrong thing by making the Commonwealth Bank private. Okay? We've got 4 major banks. I can't see why one of them can't remain a government institution
Agree.
run by strict laws instead of this absolutely revolting bloody morals of the other 3 banks in their, you know, charging dead people for fees for years and all this sort of stuff, and giving advice that's completely wrong and shocking. And I can give you instances that happened during my career. I was quite glad to get out of the bloody place as soon as they made superannuation portable and I could get out without losing the super. I went.
Well, I would be curious on that and your experiences in the bank, because that's something that seems like it's changed a lot.
That's a separate
That's a
thing.
separate
Yeah,
thing.
it'll go for a while, possibly. I dug up a letter from another.
Well, you just said actually in light of a question that we asked you before about what should be government regulated.
Yes.
At the time you said education, we got onto another subject, so you're now saying banking as well.
Yes, I am.
Well, at least one could be regulating.
Oh, no, I'm not saying it should be nationalised.
No,
And the government controls all the banks. No.
One bank.
Yes.
To be like a...
One insurance company.
Yeah. Insurance.
State government insurance, like. And that was the state, of course, but it doesn't matter, it's government insured. And they were good in those days. I used to have with SGIO, and the couple of dealings I had with them, they were spot on.
And Q Super are a great super provider.
Okay. Why is the union involved?
I don't know, but Q Super are a great super.
I know, so is Australian Super. Both have got union involvement, which I don't go along with at all. Hell, that's another story. But yes, I think there should be a key government presence in all the major enterprises like that. Not nationalisation at all, no. But there should be one straight player that we can go to if we having trouble with the others, you know. Oh, poor old Douglas. Not well, eh?
Hey.
So, pass me that. Press stop. That's a bit long enough.